Alright, everybody, welcome back. This is the end of the world with Michael and Stu.
I'm Michael.
I'm Stu, and today we are going to the root of it all.
Yes.
We're talking about one of the grand theoretical foundations upon which this podcast and many other things rest. That's right.
Yeah, we like to found our podcast on theory primarily. Yes. So
That's right. This is the first of two episodes on Atlantis. Hail Atlantis, to quote Donovan. And this episode's going to be
a long time coming in a way. I'm surprised that we got through this many episodes without our sort of foundational text, you know?
I mean, there's many foundational texts. I mean, in its way, Arrival is a foundational text. Outbreak is a foundational text. Waterworld.
An Inconvenient Truth.
The Postman, Frankenstein. You know, I mean, basically every episode is essentially a foundational text. But Atlantis, I think, is interesting because it lies in the background of many stories of disaster and apocalyptic overturning in a way that, you know, I mean, the Atlantis story is legitimately ancient. Now, how legitimately historical it is, we'll be getting into shortly. The short answer is basically it's not historical at all, as far as I can tell. But
feel free to listen on.
Yeah, but I mean, it doesn't, you know, it's no more historical than The Postman, Michael. I mean, just because something is not factually true does not mean it is not important or
right. But it'd still be pretty cool if it was also factually true. But
yeah. But I think, like, before we get started and all that, I want to talk a little bit about eschatology, which is to say the theology or mythology that is concerned with the final fate of the soul or the end of the world as it is, right? Mm-hmm. And, you know, in some mythologies, the moment of eschaton is the end of the world. Like, that's it. Lights go out, no more story. But oftentimes, these moments of eschaton are like the beginning of a new age, the turning of a page, so to speak, where it's like,
right. If anything, that's like that's the category that most of the things that we talk about on the podcast fall into. Right.
Right. Because I think the only like legit final apocalypse is like the heat death of the universe, where like the expansion of the universe pulls every individual molecule and atom so far away that any form of communication is no longer possible. But
maybe for context, why don't you what's an example that we've covered that would fall in like what's a moment of eschaton in like Arrival, and then how does this translate into like a new beginning?
Well, I think in Arrival it would be the moment the aliens arrive. It would be their arrival, if you will.
And then the new world is now that they have this gift.
That's right. Once the alien language future time ability is manifested, that inaugurates a kind of new understanding of reality. In The Postman, it would be after his triumphant battle against General Bethlehem, after reestablishing the post office. On that foundation, you know, the world is remade and
right. Information is once again possible to disseminate.
Exactly. But, you know, we're talking about the ancient Greeks today, right? Mm-hmm. And the ancient Greeks, one of the most popular mainstream mythologies, you can find eschatological moments in many cultures, but what's that?
Eschatological. I mean,
not scatological, eschatological. Very unrelated. You have a twisted mind.
I don't know. I've had some moments where it felt like the end of the world. I'll tell you that much.
Pretty good. So let's talk about the ancient Greek, like, founding myth, right? Mm-hmm. It's filled with moments of eschaton, of apocalypse. So initially there are just these two bodies there's chaos, and out of that chaos emerges Gaia, the earth. And then the sky, Uranos, emerges. And they get married. They fall in love, and they have 12 children, the Titans. And these are, Oceanus, Hyperion, Iapetus, and most importantly, of course, Kronos and Rhea. And Gaia also has, she continues to have children with Uranos, and these include a number of monsters, including the Cyclopses and the Cyclopes and the 100-handed giants. And Uranos doesn't like these. He's like, what? These freaks? How could these are not my legitimate offspring?
Well, a face only a mother could love.
I mean, exactly. 100 hands that only a mother could love. So he throws these monsters into the abyss of Tartarus and is like, be gone. But you know who's not so happy about this?
Mom.
Gaia. She's like, yo, those are my children. So she goes to her son, Kronos, and is like, your dad's gone. He's gone a little too far this time, son. So they sort of trick Kronos. They trick Uranos. Kronos castrates him.
One hell of a trick.
Yeah. His seed falls on the ocean, and out of that rises Aphrodite. That's the famous birth of Venus, which maybe you've seen in Florence. And they throw Uranos into Tartarus and let the monsters back out. The monsters, have a big party. Some would call it a monsters ball, even. But no, I should be in jail. Anyway, so that's the moment of overturning, where one set of gods, one head god is gone, and now there's a whole new gang of gods in charge, the Titans. But guess what? Same thing happens again. Kronos marries his sister Rhea. They start having children, but Kronos knows the same thing that he did to his father, that could happen to him. So as a precaution, when each of his children is born, he devours said child. And guess who doesn't like this so much?
One approach. I'm gonna guess the wife's a little pissy.
Yeah, it's just weird how this happens. This keeps happening.
Creating a very similar problem.
Yeah, so she hides away. She gives birth to her last child, Zeus, hides him away, and when Cronus is like, "Where's the child? I need to eat it," she instead just gives him a large rock, which he, not being the smartest guy around, just devours and is like, "All right, good." Now, luckily, all the children are gods, so they're growing up.
Eats a rock, and he's like, "Well, that should take care of that. Yep. That'll be the last I hear of this Zeus fella."
Meanwhile, the other gods he's already eaten are like growing up in his belly because they're gods. They're immortal. They're not dead, right? Zeus grows up elsewhere, hidden away in a cave on Crete. And when the time comes, he teams up with his friends, the 100-handed giants and the Cyclops, and they overthrow Cronus and all of Cronus' siblings, consigning them to Tartarus with Uranos. So once again, you have this sort of like cycle that repeats. A god rises to be the king of gods, has a child eventually rebels. You can see why Freud loved Greek mythology so much.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like turns out we've been saying it never ends for a really long time. Huh?
Now, Zeus is a little smarter than his dad, though, because the same thing's supposed to happen to him. Here's a prophecy. Oh, one of your sons, if you ever marry Thetis, this beautiful nymph goddess, that son that you have, he's going to do the same thing that you did to your dad, et cetera, et cetera. So Zeus is smart. He's like, all right, this shows a little self-control. He marries her off to a human, Peleus, a brave warrior, an Argonaut. And Thetis and Peleus have a son who is, of course, Achilles. So the origin story of Achilles is like, if your dad had been Zeus, you would have been the next king of the gods, but he outsmarted fate, and so you're just the greatest of all the Greek heroes. I don't know. I just think that's kind of neat. Now, all of this is, what does this have to do with Atlantis? Well, my point is that moments of catastrophic overturning are built into the Greek conception of the world. That in there,
and this is before Plato's story. Long
before, right? These are old stories that Plato would have been very familiar with. Plato was born in around 427 BCE in the midst of the Peloponnesian War.
Give or take.
Approximately.
Yeah.
That's the best guess we have based
A
on.
hell of a guess. That's an exact year.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure where that year comes from. We have pretty good dates. I mean, Plato wrote a lot. Plato was very famous in his own lifetime, had students, etc. But yeah, it's probably, it could have been 430. It could have been 426. I mean, who knows? This is in the middle of the Peloponnesian War, and the Peloponnesian War itself is an important source for Atlantis, because what happens in the Peloponnesian War? Well, this is when Athens is riding high. They have an empire, a sea empire that stretches across the Aegean with outposts, up in the Black Sea, even have dealings in Italy and other parts of the Mediterranean. It's a broad, powerful sea empire that, because of hubris, because of perhaps overreach, because of some poor choices along the way, after a 30-year war, is defeated by Sparta. This happens in Plato's lifetime. There's, an oligarchy is the famous democracy of Athens is overthrown. An oligarchy is put in place, led over by another one of Socrates' students, Critias, who we'll talk more about in a minute. And they're tyrants that rule Athens, but it only lasts for a year because Athens doesn't like kings, doesn't like tyrants. So guess what happens to Critias and all his friends?
Toast.
They're executed. That's right. And democracy is restored. Hooray! But Athens is never the same. But again, like, this is an event of a great and powerful empire that Plato himself lived at the center of, that rose to power and then was overthrown and defeated and thrown into ruin. This kind of event was happening all the time, right? I'm going over all this just because I think it's important to remember that as much as it would be cool that Atlantis is this really amazing real place that once existed, I think it's much more likely that Plato is drawing on historically verifiable events that we know he lived through in the creation of this sort of myth.
Sure. It would be doubly a hell of a coincidence if there actually was an Atlantis and these inspirations also were happening during the time that he was actually writing these things.
Yeah, and I mean, all of this plays into the two dialogues that Plato talks about Atlantis in. These are linked dialogues. One follows the other. There was going to be a third dialogue in the series that Plato never wrote for some reason, or if he did, it's completely lost. There's no record of it. Even Critias, which is the main source for our text of Atlantis, is incomplete. We're missing the last part of the dialogue. And, what's that?
Sort of like Game of Thrones.
It's exactly like that.
People in 9,000 years from now will be like, surely there was a Westeros. Right? I mean, look at all the things that were going on when Martin was alive.
I love it. I love it. So they lived through catastrophe in Plato's lifetime, and he turns these into part of the background of Atlantis, right? And, in the Timaeus and the Critias, he credits the story of Atlantis to his ancestor, the famous lawgiver and poet Solon, who is alleged to have visited Egypt in 590 BC. Now, Plato was writing this dialogue when he is pretty old. He's in his 60s when he's writing this, even though it's set back during the time
How
of the...
long did he live?
He lived until, I think, 348, so he lived to be about 80, 79. Yeah. I mean, people live to be that old pretty frequently in the ancient world if they survive childhood, right? I mean, the reason mortality is skewed so heavily is that so many people die as infants or children, right? Sure. So if you get past a certain age, you have a good chance of living basically as long as people live.
Good news. If you get past childhood, you get to experience the nightmare of old age.
Exactly. So Plato's writing this in the 360s rather, we see. It's set back during the time when Socrates was alive. Socrates is one of the characters in the dialogue, as is common in Plato's dialogues. Socrates, of course, died in 399, forced to drink hemlock, partly because of Critias, right? I mean, Socrates was the teacher of these guys that like took over and became the junta that was the 30 tyrants, right?
Mm-hmm.
So some people were like pretty angry even after they'd killed those guys. They were like, where do these guys get the chutzpah to do this? Oh, that's their buddy Socrates. So one of the crimes Socrates is accused of is corrupting the youth.
Yes.
And I think it's possible to read a political dimension into that. They say he dishonored the gods, he corrupted the youth. And Critias was perhaps one of the youths that he had, one of the two youths that he'd corrupted. So according to this Solon poem that does not exist, we've never found any evidence for this alleged poem Solon wrote about Atlantis after his trip to Egypt 100 and 200 years before Plato's writing. There is, and I think Plato, what he's doing is he's just appealing to authority. He's like Solon, whom you all know. Solon's very famous. He gave the laws to Athens. He's sort of important kind of a founding member of the Athenian elite. If he said something, that gives it this certain sheen of authority. And he did allegedly go to Egypt. So the idea that he got this on his trip.
What do you think the purpose of, let's say if he's claiming that Solon told him about or Solon had transcribed this story from ancient records, right?
Yeah, and that Critias claims to have those records.
Right, so if we assume that that's not true, right? Let's just say, because otherwise it would imply that there are ancient records or were ancient records that actually say that Atlantis was real, right? So let's say that that's not true. So what's the device? What's the point of Plato doing that? Why not just write an allegory? Or
it is an allegory, and you'll see.
I know, but why
like bother grounding it in?
Why pretending to source it in something that people would, like you said, be down to believe is authoritative?
It's a good question.
Who's this for?
Yeah, I don't entirely know. I don't have a good answer for that question.
Score one for maybe Atlantis is real. Let's carry on.
Well, hold on. Let's look at the next section of our discussion here. Okay. So Plato's Atlantis existed 9,000 years before the present, and 9,000 years before 360 BC. That's 9,360 BC.
Sure.
Athens is in the story. Athens is like the big rival to Atlantis. Athens did not exist. There was no Athens. There were no Greeks. Like the time frame, Egypt, the earliest Egyptian writing is from about 3000 BC. So that's 6,000 years after the time that this Atlantis was supposed to exist.
Right, and of course people then didn't actually know that Athens wasn't around 9,000 years ago?
No, they did not, but like 9,000 years, like it's a long span, right?
Yeah.
Now Egypt was known to be much older than the Greek civilization, of course, but even Egypt was not 9,000 years old, right?
Yeah. How much older is Egypt?
Well, as I said, like the first Egyptian civilization, I think emerges at 4,540, but the age of the pharaohs doesn't start until 3,000, around 3,000 BCE. So
that's still a long time ago.
5,000 years ago. I mean, the pyramids were built in 2,500 BC, which is, amazing. It's very old.
So that's for another episode.
We'll come back to those next week, right? It's 9,000 years old. It's enormous. It's a gigantic island that exists outside of the gates of the Mediterranean, the Pillars of Hercules. So beyond Spain, kind of where your old friends the Azores are. Like that's the general idea of where Atlantis is.
Well, it is pretty beautiful out there.
The Greeks, as far as we know, did not know of the Azores, right? And even the Romans, it doesn't seem like the Romans ever went there.
Mm-hmm.
But they didn't know about the Canary Islands, and they did know about maybe Madeira. There's some evidence, so they had some idea that there was stuff out there in the Atlantic, but They also though the size of Atlantis is interesting. He says that it's larger than Libya and Asia. Now, Libya is their name for North Africa.
Wait, hold on. Larger than Libya and Asia put together, or
Yeah, put together.
it's like, yeah, okay. Because well, of course it's larger than Libya if it's larger than Asia.
Right. No, but it's Libya, but not Asia. By Asia, they don't mean all of the continent of Asia, right?
No, right.
They had no idea about China,
Yeah.
right? They knew India, sort of. They knew India existed. Alexander had been there, right? But
Right.
or Alexander would go there. That was actually later. But they knew they traded. There was some trade with India, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like they did not know about China. No, by Asia they probably mean Anatolia, what the Romans called Asia Minor.
Okay.
But that's still huge, right? That's where modern Turkey, as we must now call it, is
Still big enough to be like, it's just funny to then be like, and Libya.
Well,
like,
Libya is like, for them, is like all the parts of North Africa that aren't Egypt.
Oh, I see.
So it's like, it's pretty huge. This is a gigantic island, okay?
It's painting a picture now. Yeah. Atlantis, right?
Yeah, and it's not fully a continent, but it's like it's almost like Australia size. Like this is a giant place.
Mm-hmm.
And Critias drawing on this alleged poem of Solon that he has in secret that no one else has ever seen, but it's like a family.
He's just hanging on to it.
Yeah, he's hanging. It's in his family.
No, I got it. It's all good. I'll tell it. I'll explain it to you.
It's in his family vault. Oh, do you want to see that? No, I can't. Sorry.
I've got it down by memory, though. I'll just
yeah, exactly. Now, Critias was real. As I said, he was one of the tyrants that ruled over Athens. He was Socrates' student. He was possibly Plato's cousin, right? And he says that, like, Atlantis was ruled by the descendants of Poseidon, the Greek god of the sea, okay? And it stretched not only from...
So it was ruled by gods?
Well, Poseidon's kids ruled it, Like, it was the land that Poseidon had the most influence over. Like, Athena had the most influence over Athens, right? And so, in this cosmology, like, the Olympian gods each have, like, spheres of influence. And Poseidon has Atlantis. And his kids are, like...
Wait, are they talking about this? So, Critias and Plato, like... Are they talking about it as though it's a myth, or are they talking about it as
it's a story? It's what the dialogues are, right? They're form. Yeah. It's like a form. It's like a play. Okay. So Socrates will say, "Tell us."
Eventually, took it literally.
Yes, although not until much later. Like,
yes, and that's next week. Yes.
Yeah, but we'll talk about how it was received in the ancient world in a second. Let me just finish the main Atlantis story. So. Basically, it's like it's a huge monarchy. Okay, that's very important, and it's the head. There's a guy called Atlas who's like the head king, and he's not the same Atlas that holds up the world or whatever, but same name. And his kids all have different fiefdoms in Atlantis. Not the same historical guy that we know is holding up the world.
Yeah, I love that. It's named after that. It's not my namesake. The guy with the holding the world up. That's not me. I'm another Atlas entirely.
No relation.
I'm my own Atlas. Goddamn.
No, we have the same first name. Our last names are very different. So this huge island nation, which has this intricate like set of canals, and it's like ringed round by three. It's a very idealized picture of It's like if you're reading a fantasy novel and you look at the map and the country is like suspiciously like geometrical in its So the way it's described, it's like
someone dreamt it.
Yeah, it's almost like it's not real. They have a war and they conquer all of Europe and North Africa. They conquer all the way to Italy, and they conquer all the way to Egypt. And Egypt is actually, like part, maybe an outpost of Atlantis, as will come up later, right? And only Athens stands against them. First, Athens has a bunch of allies, and they rally together to defeat this. And Athens, remember, is democracy. So there's a monarchical hubristic monarchy that's trying to take over the world, and only like bold democratic Athens is willing to like stand against them.
A theme that shall never rise again.
Yeah. Well, and one that was not at all similar to like the war with the Persian Empire a century before, as dramatized in the completely historically accurate film The 300. And
which we will also be watching, I'm sure.
Great. I mean, ridiculous movie, but
yeah,
not at all problematic. But anyway, so at the height of this war, Athens is sort of defeating Atlantis, pushing it back, liberating the countries. They're greeted as liberators as they storm into Italy. And so the scale of this ancient Athenian army is just massive, right? Like, far bigger than anything in actual history against this,
like, just to even cover the territory.
Yeah, against this continent, like this secret island with a giant army that's conquered all of Europe.
One plucky group.
Yeah.
Known as the Athenians. Yeah.
And at the height of this, there is a huge earthquake, and Atlantis sinks overnight. Right. The whole.
But Athens was on the way to winning.
Oh, Athens had already basically won. Like, Athens, the tide had turned.
Kind of like a Little Giant scenario. Just one time.
Yeah, exactly. It's like they're about to like conquer Atlantis itself, and the gods intervene. They're like, this has gone far enough. I've seen enough.
Now,
Atlantis, red card.
Athens, like, you could have done this before. The lost generation hadn't been killed for this.
Yeah. And Atlantis sinks into the sea and is gone, and creates a massive shoal in the ocean that thereafter renders the Atlantic Ocean impassable to ships, which we know to be historically true because no ship has ever sailed across the Atlantic Ocean. Anyway, so that's the story. And what we note is that, Atlantis is described as being insanely wealthy. There's like this giant gold temple to Poseidon in the middle of it, in the central island, and then it's ringed round by these other like rings of islands. And
but is the idea that the people are treated well there as well? Like,
it's a tyranny.
So the life for the individual citizen is terrible.
Yeah, I mean, presumably,
and that's why they go liberate it, right? It's not to defend themselves.
Well, I think the point is that eventually, as Atlantis moves east, it's going to get to Greece and conquer Athens too. So Athens, like, proactively preventing that by going to war.
You'd rather fight them over there than over here.
We don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud, Michael.
Right.
It's very grand, but one thing that we'll notice is not present is that there's no mention in the Critias of Atlantis having any kind of like magical technology. There's no, which is, I think, like a pretty big feature of the idea of Atlantis as a modern myth. Is
a huge part of it, isn't it?
Yeah,
that the whole civilization is wildly advanced, right? Isn't that the idea?
Well, I mean, we were talking about Game of Thrones earlier, right? And it's like Valyria is just Atlantis, right? That's where the Targaryens came from, and they had this magic, and they had dragons, they had all this cool stuff, and then one day it blew up. Mm-hmm. It's like 100% what George R. R. Martin is thinking of. But there's no, so basically it's just this tyrannical country that has like strong monarchical tendencies, tries to take over. The democratic Athens fights back, defeats them, and then the gods, annoyed by Atlantis' hubris, cause an earthquake that causes a tidal wave that causes it to literally sink into the sea.
Along with their iPhones and whatever else they had,
which they don't have, right? They're just another ancient, Greek style hoplite armies, presumably, chariots, maybe. I mean, anyway, where's Plato getting this from? If we accept that, one thing, there's no evidence that Atlantis is never mentioned anywhere in Egypt, right? We've never found any, like, documentary proof in old.
No one ever found this ancient record.
No, and like there are hieroglyphs on walls and papyri that we found in tombs of pharaohs and scratched on the walls.
All number of things.
Any number of things. There's stelae commemorating all sorts of ancient battles and wars.
Maybe they just wanted to forget about it, you know.
the war from 9,000 years ago, which
we do not speak of Atlantis.
But when Solon came to town, they were like, "Oh, Solon, here.
There is this one record. Here, why don't you put it in your vault? It's safe in your."
Solon, why don't you turn this into a poem that you can then pass down to your great grandnephew Critias or whatever?
Yeah.
What is like the source for this story? Is it a popular theory was that the story of Atlantis contains a memory of the Bronze Age collapse, which we've thankfully already done an episode on, so everyone should know everything about it, because in our 1 hour episode, we completely, comprehensively, in our non-expert manner, covered that material. But the Bronze Age collapse, as you'll recall, was an event around 1200 BCE where a number of large civilizations in the Mediterranean collapsed in quick order within 20 to 30 years, went from being thriving, powerful civilizations to being nothing. And
a variety of wars and environmental catastrophes.
Yeah, we talked about there's a bunch of reasons why. Is this a memory of the fact that there used to be these grand, and the Greeks were one of the civilizations that collapsed most completely, right? We talked about Mycenaean Greece. And, even before that, there was around 1500 BCE, there was the destruction of Akrotiri, which is on the modern island of Santorini, a very popular vacation spot. Have you ever been to Santorini?
No. It's pretty pricey.
Yeah, it's pretty fancy. I haven't been either. I've been to Kos and Rhodos, which are also quite nice. But I'm more interested in archaeology. I should go to Santorini though, because there was a volcano there, and this ties into our Pompeii episode, where in around 1500 BC, a massive volcano exploded, and it was an eruption even bigger than the one that happened at Pompeii. An entire Minoan city was buried in ash and has been partially excavated. You can go and see the ruins of this very beautiful, that's where the art for the episode, image for this episode comes from, is actually
cool.
A painting from the Minoan civilization. But is it possible that Plato, in writing the story of Atlantis, is thinking back to either of these two catastrophes from, 1,000 years, essentially, before his lifetime? This was
No.
What's that? You're guessing no.
I feel like when people think about the ancients, they have a way of condensing time, like to truly think about, our use of memory from 1024 seems like it's scarce at best. It's hard to imagine that this is the origin of this story.
What, you don't have like family stories about what your ancestors were getting up to in Italy or wherever in 1024, Michael? Because in my family, we're always talking about, that was when Eric the Dane, he burst into our cottage, the family cottage in Kilkenny or wherever. Yeah, I think that's a really good point, right? People imagine like Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great were like hanging out together.
Duking it out.
Yeah, it's 300 years between them, but you never mind, right? Or that like the Trojan War, the actual event, was something, that by the time the historical Trojan War is transmitted to later Greeks, 500 years have passed, and like Apollo is on the battlefield, like shooting people with a magic bow and arrow, right?
Yeah.
So it's not exactly like, but that said, the poems of Homer do exist,
Yeah.
So maybe there's some, but scholars tend to agree with you. They're like, no, this is unlikely. Like, for the reasons you say, like this is something that happened very, very long time before any of this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a more recent event is the destruction of the Peloponnesian city of Helike in 373 BC. So just within 10 years of Plato writing this story. there was a little town, not a huge city, but a city nonetheless, that because of an earthquake, a tsunami came and literally like destroyed the entire town to the point where once had been a town, there was now just like a lake, a lagoon. And for years, hundreds of years afterwards, people would take boat trips over it. And you look down and you could like see the statues and see the like, the ruins of which had been flooded over. And this is an event that Plato probably would have heard about. It was something that occurred not that far from Athens and was a big enough deal. So the idea of like a city being swallowed, that's something that was like in the zeitgeist, if you will.
Right. But that's also like
quite different.
Someone with an imagination could just think of that too for the end of his story.
Right. And that's also why I told at the beginning of the episode was talking about all the like floods and destructive myths in Greece, this idea of like a city or a civilization being wiped out by like the gods or whatever is very familiar. Now, what's missing from Plato's story? Well, we've already talked about one major thing that's missing, and that is any of the advanced technology that we've come to associate with Atlantis in the modern day, right?
So the civilization of Atlantis, just to be clear, is completely of the time that he's referring to. Like, there's no sense that it looks like modern day Athens, for example, like the one that Plato's living in.
Well, that's the thing, is like the Athens that fights like against Atlantis seems to be the Athens of Plato's day, right? There's this idea of Atlantis being this like of Athens being this unchanging thing that stretches back 9,000 years, when in point of fact, like the Athens of like 600 BC, like 250 years beforehand, was like would have been unrecognizable to Plato, right? I mean, the time of Solon, right? It's like the ships would have looked different, the battle formations, the art would have looked much more archaic, and like
the power structure, all that. Yeah,
the government would have been very different, right? The democracy would not exist. There were tyrants that were ruling Athens, right? And the whole part of this is like Athens is this democracy that fights off tyranny. It's like Athens was like ruled by kings like in 520 BCE. Like what are you talking about? So there's none of that. And, as I said, Egyptian civilization itself doesn't even get started until around 4000 BCE. And even then they don't have records for another 1,000 years after that. So like this idea that, there was this like, massive vault of like lost knowledge is just a modern fantasy, right? Now, another thing that I said I was going to mention earlier is that, like, no one in the ancient world takes this seriously. Okay. Like, no one of Plato's contemporaries or any of the
people didn't start, like, trying to dive really deep into random
no one's, like, launching expeditions to go out to, like, look for the ruins of Atlantis beyond.
Some brand new weapons they can bring up to shore and take over the world. And
right. And as we've already said, there were no they would have had the same weapons as everyone else, right? There's no mention of of Atlantis in any of the geography texts of people like Strabo. And, we know that the Romans like went out into the Atlantic a little bit. The Carthaginians certainly did. The Carthaginians may have gone all the way around Africa. Like
just once?
Just once? It's pretty far.
I just like to envision they just do it one time and they're like, all right,
mission accomplished.
We've seen it. We've seen it.
That's pretty good. So I think like just to like wrap up this first episode, like basically Atlantis is an allegory, right? It's not something that has any kind of historical analog that we can find. Any comparison we might want to make to the Minoan collapse, the Thera eruption, or even to the Helike, like tsunami, it all feels like just a little tendentious, like a little specious. Like we're reaching for a connection that maybe isn't really there. Would you agree with that? Does that strike you as?
Yeah, I mean, so what do we think? We think then that that Plato's just trying to tell a story that illustrates the relative benevolence of the democratic Athenian system versus any old monarchy, any old
Yeah, I
form.
mean, I'm doing this a little bit of an injustice because I'm not really, I mean, I've done some work on Plato, but I'm not a real Plato scholar, you
Hmm.
know.
Me neither.
Well, we'll have to get one on the pod one of these days, but
Yeah.
um I think, you know, Plato's big idea for like the ideal system of government is like the republic,
Yep.
which in point of fact represents Sparta more than it represents Athens, which is kind of weird, right? I mean, it's a sort of fascist system, right? Where these guardians like
I have
are
no experience with the fascist republic to draw on to understand what you're talking about, Stu.
how could such a thing be possible?
Luckily, we've cleaned that problem up.
But you know, in the Republic, there's like this very hierarchized civilization, and some scholars have been like, well, actually, Atlantis is sort of similar to the Republic, and its mistake was overreaching, right? Its mistake was hubris, and other people have said, no, Atlantis is a contrast with this idealized ancient Athens, which is probably more similar to the Republic. Part of the problem is we don't have the end of the freaking story. So it literally cuts off like mid sentence. And he's describing it. He describes Atlantis. He's like, yada, yada. And they have this many gods and there's temples to. It's very dull. Like, I was reading it being like, all right, when's he going to get to the like the time machine that the Atlanteans have? Or there's none of that, right? Would the Atlanteans have laser rifles, plasma rifles? You know, like the one the Terminator is looking for. No, they don't.
We'll find out next week.
Yeah,
for sure.
Now, just a little preview. Like, what do you have any experience with like modern versions of Atlantis? When you hear like, what do you?
I mean,
think?
just the sort of generic ideas that we've been talking about. Yeah, the lost advanced civilization
that started it all.
Yeah, sort of like all of this has happened before, all of this will happen again, with the Battlestar Galactica of it all.
Oh yeah. Or like some kind of once and future, you know, like Atlantis fell and then Rome fell and then is America next? Like, so like as if it's some.
You see you can see the article already in like the Atlantic, you know, like is America on the way to becoming the next Atlantis?
In the Atlantic, named after. Ooh.
Right.
Atlantis, right?
Yeah.
Ooh.
This is a connection we cannot deny.
Yeah. So I think the Atlantis story is interesting, but it's not even like these are like the worst dialogues of Plato. Like these are not like the top flight dialogues.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like
these aren't even the good dialogues.
They
like
are.
that.
No, I read this scholarly article from a while. It was quite dated, but its point was like one thing that's interesting is not the Critias, but the Timaeus, which is the other. The Timaeus makes like an incredibly brief reference to Atlantis. And then the Critias comes next, and that's where Critias expands the sort of Atlantean lore. The Timaeus was the only the only dialogue of Plato that was available in the Middle Ages. And I was reading this scholar, and he's like, the Timaeus is the most repugnant of all of Plato's work to the modern sensibilities. And not because of the Atlantis stuff, just because of this other arguments that Timaeus puts forth in it. I mean, I love Plato. I think Plato is like one of the greatest writers who ever lived. I think as literary texts, the dialogues are incredibly alive. As literary texts responding to the historical contingencies and circumstances in which Plato himself lived, I think they're incredibly valuable. But in point of fact, like, they're fictional. Like, we don't know if the real Socrates was anything like the Socrates that appears in Plato's text, right? And in fact, we have dialogues by other students of Socrates. We have dialogues by Xenophon, in which Socrates behaves in a manner completely at odds with his behavior in Plato. So it's like, we can't even rely on Plato to give like a historically accurate depiction of his greatest mentor, the mentor who gave his life for the ideals of like the philosophical life and for his dedication to Athens, right?
Right.
So why are we suddenly being like, no, like, yeah, someone had a gun to Plato's head. Actually, this Atlantis stuff is just 100% accurate. Like, but we'll get into all of that next week. And next week's going to be a little bit less historically oriented and a little bit more batshit insane, like American conspiracy theory oriented.
Yeah, we'll be back squarely in the wheelhouse next week.
Absolutely. But I think this was fun because I think it strangely tied together a lot of the other episodes that we've done.
Yeah, I mean, it also just goes to show, like, no matter what point of history you find, there are people who, there's an obsession with the end of the world, with the end of the soul and the restarting of things, right? And I think that basically applies to everything that we've been talking about for the last, I don't know, God, however many months it's been. Feels like it's been 9,000 years, but
I think this is our 8th month. Yeah, but
right.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm looking forward to getting into all of that. And if you like this sort of thing, you should definitely subscribe to the podcast. Tell a friend about the podcast.
Tell 2 friends.
Tell 3 friends. Follow us on Instagram at the End of the World WMS. We've been posting some amazing reels that have just been racking up.
I know. It's kind of stunning. It's shocking. It's taking up my whole day, like fending off the adoration and criticism all at once.
Yeah, it's a hard life, the life of the podcaster.
It's almost a part-time job, isn't it, as they say?
Yeah. All right, but until next time, this has been The End of the World with Michael and Stu.
I'm Michael.
And I'm Stu, and we'll talk to you real soon.